Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a comparison video of another Versus episode between the new Viltrox Pro AF 27mm F1.2 and then the Sigma 23mm F1.4. Now, I realize that they aren't the identical focal length or even have an identical maximum aperture, but what is nearly identical is their price. Both of them will cost you right under $550 US, which means that these are legitimate lenses that you could cross shop even more so than the equivalent, say 23mm F1.4 from Fuji, which is going to cost you about $350 more than either one of these lenses. So today we're going to break down the different areas of performance, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you what I consider to be the relative strengths of each lens, why you should choose one versus the other. And then for those of you that are interested in a deeper dive, I've got all the supporting evidence that I'll follow up with after the conclusion. So we'll do a deep dive into the image quality for those of you that want to hang around and watch at that point. And so you can actually see what goes on behind the conclusions that I have drawn. So we'll start, however, by taking a look at the general autofocus performance, because a lot of you have asked me about that, and what I have found that really there is more similarities than differences in the autofocus performance between these two lenses. Now, obviously, if you're looking for the optimum autofocus performance, probably the original Fuji 23mm with its linear motors is going to give you the best autofocus performance. But in terms of these, as you can see here, both of them focus relatively similarly in terms of just basic speed, though I will note that the Sigma has a little bit of a quirk where there's almost a lag before you can start to make another autofocus change. And so it almost like it hangs there for a moment and then you can start moving once again. But in terms of the actual speed going back and forth, they are roughly similar. Likewise, when it came to video focus pools, I found that both of them had fairly similar performance in terms of back and forth. The Sigma might show a few more steps than what the Viltrox does, but every now and then the Viltrox will do an extra back pulse, and so they're roughly equal when it comes to video pools, and I would say they are roughly similar when it comes to the amount of focus breathing that is present between the two lenses. There's very low focus breathing on the Fuji XF 23mm F1.4 LM lens. So let's talk about some reasons that the Sigma is the superior of the two lenses, or areas that might advantage it. The first is a quite obvious one, and that is that it is considerably smaller than what the Viltrox lens is. It is 65.8 millimeters in diameter versus 82 millimeters in diameter for the Viltrox. The overall length is 77 millimeters versus 92 millimeters for the Viltrox. The Sigma is very close in size to the actual Fuji lens, whereas the Viltrox is obviously considerably larger. The Sigma is also much lighter. It weighs in at 340 grams versus 560 grams for the Viltrox. So they're not even really quite in the same class of lens in terms of size and weight. We'll also note that something that Sigma does really well is lens hoods, and of the three lenses, including the Fuji, I would take the Sigma's lens hood above them all. It has a greater variety of textures, it feels nicer in the hand, it just feels better made in general. Also, I found that in my comparisons back and forth between the two lenses that I would say the Sigma is slightly sharper in the corner of the frame. And particularly at wide apertures, the Sigma has a slight advantage there. I also found that the Sigma had a nicer looking sun star. It has 9 aperture blades versus 11 aperture blades in the Viltrox. And while those 11 blades do have a very clear advantage when it comes to keeping a circular shape, when it comes to the sun star, the Sigma has a better looking star that has 18 blades versus 22 blades, and it's just cleaner and better defined. However, there are also a lot of reasons to choose the Viltrox over the Sigma. First of all, it comes to the basic build here. There's no question that the Viltrox is the better made lens. Not that there's a radical difference in the feel of the materials between the two, but whereas the Sigma has only a single gasket at the lens mount, the Viltrox is thoroughly weather sealed, and as you can see from this diagram, there's actually 10 different seal points throughout the Viltrox lens, and so it is a more professional grade build between the two. The Viltrox also has the advantage of having an aperture ring, something that is pretty much standard on Fuji and something that the Sigma lacks at this point. I also found when it comes to autofocus that while the overall speed wasn't radically different, I did feel that in just real-world general use, I had better accuracy with the Viltrox, just more consistently well-focused results with it. One thing that is hugely different between the two lenses is that the Viltrox has much nicer bokeh. It has less of a nervous quality, there's much less outlining, less fringing around it. The bokeh is really, really nice from this lens, whereas the Sigma, while being a very sharp lens, it just doesn't have fantastic bokeh in my opinion. The Viltrox also has lower chromatic aberrations. Not that either one of these lenses suffers badly from chromatic aberrations, but the Viltrox is more neutral with less fringing than what the Sigma has. It obviously also has a faster maximum aperture. F1.2 is about a third stop faster than what F1.4 is. And while that's not a radical difference, it means that in low light situations you have that much more light that is coming into the sensor of the lens. It also has what I would claim to be a nicer overall rendering of images. It has very nice real-world contrast, as we'll see on our breakdown, and there's just a little bit more nuance to the optical performance that I personally strongly prefer versus the Sigma lens. Now, I will just remember after my conclusion here, we will do an in-depth breakdown, and so you can see these two lenses side by side in a wide variety of situations. So if you're interested, stay tuned for that. But my conclusion is that both lenses, fortunately, are definitely sharp enough to handle the 40 megapixel sensor that Fuji has moved to in some of its top cameras. There aren't a lot of lenses that can do that at this point, and so that means that we're getting very good bang for the buck with either one of these lenses if sharpness is the absolute priority. Obviously, if your priority is to go as small a lens as possible at this price point while still retaining high optical performance, the Sigma is a great choice. It is considerably smaller and lighter than what the Viltrox is, and so that could be a very strong reason to consider it. There's also, of course, the difference in focal length in general, and that some of you will prefer the basically 35mm equivalent to right over 40mm equivalent of the Viltrox, and so there are some reasons to consider it. If absolute image quality is your priority, the Viltrox, I feel, is in another class. Not that it's sharper, there's some give and take as we're going to see in our breakdown, but it is in a class above in that it has a more pro build, it has softer bokeh, it has a richer overall rendering, in my opinion, that makes images just more special coming out of it. And so if absolute image quality is your priority, go with the Viltrox. It really is a very special lens. So for those of you that are still here, let's dive in deeper and let's take a look at the image quality and break it down together. So throughout this comparison, we'll keep the Sigma on the left and the Viltrox on the right. And so as you can see by looking at our test chart here for distortion and vignette, the Viltrox has noticeably lower distortion, just a very mild amount of barrel distortion there, whereas it's more pronounced on the Sigma. You can also see that there is not only less vignette, but the vignette doesn't encroach as far into the frame, whereas here on the Sigma, you can see more vignette in the fact that it encroaches further into the frame. Probably the advantage of having a larger lens for the Viltrox. Now, in terms of sharpness, this is a 200% magnification on the 40 megapixel XH2. So if we look in the center of the frame, both of these lenses are, of course, intensely sharp. I would say very slightly more contrast for the Sigma in the middle of the frame, but very likely a little bit more detail that's being rendered on the Viltrox, and just a little bit finer resolution of the lines here you can see are just a little bit better pronounced here on the Viltrox. In the mid frame, both of them looking good. Lighting is not identical here. Down in this zone, we can see that they look quite similar, maybe a little bit better for the Sigma. And down into the corner, I would say the Sigma has, again, a slight advantage. If we look over on this side, it's more noticeable advantage for the Sigma. Now, if we move the Viltrox onto f1.4 and we take a look again, we can see that now contrast has boosted a little bit on the Viltrox. Also, its ability to render the fine details is a little bit better. So a little bit stronger performance in the middle of the frame for the Viltrox, though the Sigma does have a lot of contrast punch to it. If we look in this zone here, the Sigma is a little bit darker, but you can see there's more detail there on the Viltrox, where it tends to be a little bit blockier here on the Sigma. In the mid frame here, we can see a similar type result, and then down into the bottom, we can see that the corners are more close here with the Sigma, or excuse me, with the Viltrox to the Sigma, but we can also see at the same time that I would say that there is maybe a slight advantage for the Sigma that still remains. Now, if we stop the lenses down to f2 and we look at the center of the frame, both of them are intensely sharp at this point, but again, the Viltrox has the ability to just give us a little bit finer detail. Contrast is really strong on the Sigma, but the fine detail is a little bit better on the Viltrox. Going back over here again, you can really see that here where the Viltrox really shows all of those details here in a way that the Sigma doesn't. Down in the corners, the performance is close, but I definitely favor the Sigma's rendering close to the bottom. If we look here in this zone, the same is true, and if I pop up to the top here, I would say the Viltrox looks a little bit better at that end. So, you know, there's some give and take, obviously, across the frame. It's in the real world scenarios, however, where the Viltrox's advantage grows somewhat. So if we see here looking at sharpness and contrast once again, we can see that the two look fairly similar on our area of focus. However, if we move over into this zone, we can see that there's just a little bit more richness to the rendering on the Viltrox, and you can just see the textures on the beans, coffee beans, just look a little bit more intense. And then if we kind of pan up this way, we can see that all the background, even though we've equalized the framing here and we're shooting at the same aperture of f1.4, that the background is still bigger and softer on the Viltrox lens. Looking towards the defocus area, it is just smoother. There's some outlining here that isn't as persistent on the Viltrox. Now here we have a pretty plain shot through a window that obviously needs a little bit of cleaning, but here what we're looking for is fringing in the out of focus area. So both lenses focused along here on the window frame. You can see that again, even though we've tried to equalize the settings, the Viltrox just has a softer background. But more importantly, in all of these various white transition areas, you can just see there's more fringing on the Sigma, whereas the Viltrox is more neutral. It's also more pleasing because it just renders everything a little bit softer. And so as a byproduct, in these areas where fringing could occur, the softer and slightly less amount of the fringing that you see on the Sigma that's not there present on the Viltrox makes for just a richer looking image. Now in this shot where I shoot for flare resistance, there's really not a lot of difference to be seen, and neither the sun being just right up out of the frame on both of these, I don't see any kind of a ghosting spots or anything like that marring either one of the images. So a fairly similar performance there. Now, if we recompose with the sun actually in the frame, we can see that there's just a very slight difference between the two if we're shooting both at f1.4. The Viltrox gives a little bit more of a kind of glow effect where the sun comes through, whereas the Sigma is just more prone to start to create the blades of a sun star. But in neither case do we see any kind of ghosting artifact causing a problem. Now, if we stop the lenses down to f11, I prefer the Sun Star from the Sigma. It has a 9 aperture iris, and so that gives us 18 pointed stars, whereas the 11 aperture blades on the Viltrox make for softer bokeh and rounder bokeh highlights, but not quite as a convincing a Sun Star. Now, there is a little bit of a ghosting artifact here, maybe a little bit there for the Viltrox, but I would say that neither one of them are doing a bad job in this instance. Now, it's in a shot like this where the Viltrox really starts to pull ahead. And so again, I've tried to equalize the framing, shooting both at f1.4. Both of them are nice and sharp on the actual subject where we're focused here. But if you look at these two areas, I like the contrast in the plane of focus. There's just more detail in the textures on the Viltrox. But more importantly, as we start to look towards the defocused area, the Sigma shows much more outlining. It's much less creamy and soft in this zone, whereas if you look comparing down here with the Viltrox just makes everything softer without any of these kind of distracting circling areas in this out of focus area. It's just more of just a consistent creaminess, whereas there's just more nervousness in the Sigma rendering, not to mention that the bokeh highlights are all bigger and softer on the Viltrox lens. And of course, that's not to mention the fact that with the Viltrox, you can open it up to F1.2, which of course makes the depth of field more shallow, but we can see it still has nice contrast. And if we look towards the defocused area, the difference between the two lenses becomes even more pronounced as the Viltrox is able to just render the background really, really soft compared to what the Sigma is producing. I really noticed it on this particular shot because there's more of a transition zone here. So first of all, we'll pop in and look at the subject. Both of them do a great job on the subject. I mean, really good contrast and detail. You can see those fine little hairs that are pronounced there on the Viltrox rendering. All of that looks great. But if we start panning to the left here, the Viltrox stays much softer with this kind of tangle of bare branches, whereas the Sigma gets really quite distracting in the way that it renders everything. Again, both of them at f1.4. You can see the framing here. Look at this nail. They're both framed about the same here. And so it's just a matter of the difference between the two lenses and how that they're able to render these areas so much softer on the Viltrox here on the right, with much more kind of circling and outlining on the Sigma. Also, you can see there's more green fringing around the bokeh highlights, where on the Viltrox they're just more neutral. Now in this particular shot, it just so happened that the Sigma actually is framing tighter than what the Viltrox is. And you can see the Sigma looks larger than what the Viltrox does. So here in the case, it's actually got a higher magnification. It's got an advantage here. But again, if you look at the bokeh circles beyond, they're just, everything out here is just much softer and nicer on the Viltrox lens. Now near their minimum focus distance, the Sigma is giving us very slightly higher magnification, as you can see here. They're very quite close, but the Sigma I think is just a little bit higher there. But again, the big difference is that if we look towards the background here, there's just, again, more outlining. Everything is just softer and creamier in the image. So I just naturally favor the image on the right coming off of the Viltrox. Now finally, if we take this inside one more time, and so here was our plane of focus, you can see that both lenses are about equally sharp. They're delivering really, really great detail here on the subject. But as we start to, again, pan towards the background, you can see the Viltrox is just so much softer. As we get to this zone, there's much more outlining, more fringing from the Sigma. And whereas the Viltrox is just staying softer, and it's for that reason that I certainly favor it for its overall rendering. And of course, that difference becomes even more pronounced if I switch over to the f1.2 rendition, because you can see that even at f1.2, it's delivering very similar levels of sharpness to the Sigma. But as we look towards these background elements, it just is so much nicer, so much creamier in the way that it renders these backgrounds to where they're softer and just generally more pleasing. And so that means that as you look at the images as a whole, the Viltrox wins overall in image quality. Thanks for watching today. In the description down below, you can find linkage to the full review of either one of these lenses or their image gallery, and buying links for both. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.